When surgeons opened Louis XIV in 1715, they found something that terrified them. His organs were so grotesquely enlarged that they questioned if he was entirely human. The French court immediately buried the truth. What they discovered inside the Sun King's body was hidden for centuries. And by the end of this video, you'll know exactly what they tried to erase from history. September 1st, 1715. The Palace of Versailles fell into a silence so profound that courtiers whispered it felt like the sun itself had been extinguished. Louis XIV, the man who had ruled France for 72 years, had finally drawn his last breath. Within hours, something unprecedented began to unfold in the depths of the palace. Royal surgeon Georges Maréchal received orders that made his hands tremble. The king's body must be opened. This wasn't just controversial, it was borderline heretical. The Catholic Church viewed autopsies as desecration, a violation of the sacred vessel that housed the soul. But the court physicians had been documenting strange symptoms for years, bizarre medical anomalies that defied explanation. Louis's appetite had been legendary, superhuman even. His capacity for food shocked everyone who witnessed it. Servants reported meals that could feed entire families consumed by one man in a single sitting. Something was profoundly wrong, and now, with the king dead, they finally had permission to discover what. Maréchal gathered his team in a sealed chamber, away from prying eyes. The tools were prepared, sterilized in wine and flame. As night fell over Versailles, candlelight flickered across surgical instruments that would soon reveal a truth so disturbing that the French court would spend centuries trying to bury it. The autopsy room was located in a remote wing of the palace, chosen specifically for its distance from the main court. Maréchal had performed hundreds of dissections throughout his career, but never on someone of this magnitude, never on a king. The body of Louis XIV lay on a marble slab, draped in royal purple silk that would soon be pulled away. Present in the room were only the most trusted physicians, men who had sworn oaths of absolute secrecy. They understood that what they were about to document could never be fully revealed to the public. The king's reputation, the very legitimacy of the monarchy, depended on maintaining the image of divine perfection. But science demanded truth, and these men were, above all, scientists. As Maréchal lifted his scalpel, he noticed something immediately unusual. The king's abdomen was distended, swollen far beyond what death and natural decomposition could explain. It looked almost pregnant, bulging outward in a way that suggested massive internal pressure. The other physicians exchanged glances, their faces betraying the first hints of unease. This was already abnormal, and they hadn't even made the first incision yet. Maréchal positioned his blade just below the sternum, preparing for the standard Y incision that would open the chest and abdomen. He pressed down, and the scalpel sliced through skin that had once been kissed by nobles and feared by enemies across Europe. What happened next would be recorded in hushed, coded language in the official autopsy report, but the physician's private letters told a different story. As Maréchal pulled back the layers of skin and tissue, the abdominal cavity seemed to burst open, revealing organs of such unnatural size that several witnesses actually stepped backward in shock. This wasn't subtle. This wasn't a minor variation in anatomy. What they saw defied every medical text, every dissection they had ever performed on criminals, paupers, or nobles. The stomach alone looked like it belonged to an animal, not a human being. It dominated the abdominal space, pushing other organs aside, stretched and enlarged to proportions that seemed physically impossible. One physician, Jean-Baptiste Silva, would later write in a private letter that he initially thought there had been some terrible mistake, that perhaps they had accidentally begun dissecting a large animal brought from the royal menagerie. But no, this was unmistakably human in structure, just grotesquely, impossibly oversized. The room fell into an eerie silence broken only by the scratching of quills, as scribes documented measurements that would seem like fabrications to anyone who hadn't witnessed them firsthand. And this was just the beginning. Maréchal's hands worked methodically, but his mind raced. In all his years of medical practice, studying under the greatest anatomists in Europe, dissecting bodies in the charity hospitals of Paris, nothing had prepared him for this moment. The stomach of Louis XIV wasn't just large, it was monstrous. Where a normal human stomach might measure 15 to 20 centimeters in length, the king's stretched nearly double that dimension. But size alone didn't capture the full horror of what they observed. The organ walls were thickened, tough like leather that had been stretched and worked for decades. You could see the evidence of constant, extreme distension. Areas where the tissue had thinned dangerously, spots where it had torn and healed, creating scar tissue that spoke of years of internal suffering. The stomach lining showed signs of chronic inflammation, ulceration, and damage that would have caused excruciating pain. Yet historical records showed that Louis XIV rarely complained about stomach pain, at least not in his earlier years. Had he simply grown accustomed to a level of discomfort that would have hospitalized any normal person? Silva carefully measured the stomach's capacity, using a technique where they filled the organ with measured amounts of water. A normal stomach holds approximately 1 to 1.5 liters comfortably, maybe 2 liters at maximum distension during a large meal. Louis XIV's stomach held nearly 4 liters before showing signs of reaching its limit. 4 liters. Think about that for a moment. That's more than a gallon of liquid, of food, of wine, sitting in one organ. To put this in perspective, competitive eaters today, people who train their bodies specifically to consume massive quantities of food, typically max out around 3 to 4 liters, and they do so only occasionally, not multiple times daily for decades. But Louis XIV wasn't a competitive eater. He was a king who simply ate like this naturally, or perhaps unnaturally. The implications were staggering. Every meal, every feast, every casual dining experience was stretching his stomach beyond what human anatomy should tolerate. And the stomach was only part of the story. As Marechal moved down to examine the intestines, the true scale of the anatomical nightmare became apparent. The small intestine in an average adult measures about 6 to 7 meters in length, coiled efficiently within the abdominal cavity. Louis XIV's small intestine measured over 10 meters, nearly double the normal length. But length wasn't the only issue. The diameter of the intestinal loops was also enlarged, swollen like pythons that had swallowed prey too large. The colon showed similar proportions, stretched and distended in ways that suggested decades of extreme use. The physicians realized they were looking at a digestive system that had literally grown to accommodate the king's legendary appetite. But how does this even happen? How does a human body transform itself so dramatically? The answer lies in a terrifying combination of biological adaptation and physical trauma. The human digestive system, particularly the stomach and intestines, possesses a remarkable ability to stretch and adapt. When you consistently consume large amounts of food, the stomach walls gradually expand to accommodate the increased volume. It's a survival mechanism, really, designed to help humans adapt to feast or famine conditions. But Louis XIV had perverted this natural adaptation into something monstrous. From the moment he became king at age 4, though truly ruling after his mother's regency, Louis had access to unlimited food. The royal kitchens at Versailles employed hundreds of people whose sole purpose was preparing elaborate meals. Historical records document feasts with 30, 40, even 50 courses. And Louis didn't just taste these dishes, he consumed them. Observers noted that he ate with a speed and volume that astonished foreign dignitaries. The Duchess of Orléans wrote that the king could eat 4 plates of soup, an entire pheasant, a partridge, a large plate of salad, mutton with garlic, 2 large slices of ham, a plate of pastries, and then fruit and hard-boiled eggs, all in one sitting. And this wasn't a special occasion, this was a regular dinner. Year after year, decade after decade, this pattern continued. Every single day, multiple times per day, Louis XIV stuffed himself to capacity and beyond. His stomach had no choice but to adapt or rupture, and somehow, impossibly, it adapted. The muscle walls thickened and stretched. The organ grew larger, demanding more food to feel satisfied, creating a vicious cycle. The more he ate, the more his stomach expanded. The more his stomach expanded, the more he needed to eat to feel full. It was a biological feedback loop that spiraled into the grotesque anatomy now laid bare on the autopsy table. The intestines followed suit, stretching to accommodate the massive boluses of food constantly flowing through them. The colon, responsible for the final stages of digestion, became a bloated tube struggling to process volumes it was never designed to handle. Marechal noted extensive scarring throughout the digestive tract, evidence of tears, blockages, and infections that had occurred over the years. The king's body had been engaged in a constant war with itself, trying to process food intake that exceeded human limits. And somehow, for 77 years, it had managed to keep functioning, keep the king alive, even if the cost was this horrifying transformation of his internal anatomy. Standing over the dissection table, the physicians began to grasp the full scope of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just medical curiosity, this was a fundamental challenge to their understanding of human biology. The question burning in every mind was the same. Could gluttony alone cause this level of anatomical deformity? Was decades of overeating sufficient to transform a human digestive system into this oversized monstrosity? Or was there something else, something deeper, something possibly genetic, that had predisposed Louis XIV to this condition from birth? Marechal had studied the medical reports kept by the royal physicians throughout Louis's life. Even as a child, the young king had shown an unusual appetite. At age 7, he could out-eat adults twice his size. By his teenage years, servants were already commenting on the extraordinary quantities of food he consumed. This suggested that the massive digestive system they now observed hadn't been solely created by lifestyle, it had been enabled by an underlying biological abnormality. The human body doesn't typically allow the stomach to expand to twice its normal size, no matter how much you eat. There are limits, fail-safes built into our physiology. For Louis XIV to have achieved this level of organ enlargement, something in his basic anatomy must have been different from birth. Medical science in 1715 didn't have the tools to identify genetic disorders, but the physicians weren't ignorant. They understood heredity, they knew that traits passed from parents to children, they had observed patterns of disease and physical characteristics running through family lines. And the Bourbon dynasty had a history of peculiarities. Louis XIV's father, Louis XIII, had also been noted for an unusual appetite, though not to the same extreme degree. His grandfather, Henry IV, was famous for his love of food and robust eating habits. Going back further, the Bourbon line showed recurring patterns of obesity, digestive issues, and what we might today recognize as symptoms of metabolic disorders. Could there have been a genetic component, a hereditary condition that gave Louis XIV a digestive system capable of this extreme expansion? Modern medical knowledge suggests several possibilities. Prader-Willi syndrome, a genetic disorder that causes insatiable hunger and can lead to obesity and stretched digestive organs, might explain some aspects of what the autopsy revealed. Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, a connective tissue disorder that makes tissues more elastic and prone to stretching, could account for the extreme expandability of his stomach and intestines. There are also various forms of gigantism that affect specific organs rather than overall body size. But here's what makes the case of Louis XIV truly fascinating from a medical perspective. He wasn't obese, at least not by the standards we would expect. Yes, he gained weight as he aged, particularly in his final decades. But portraits and contemporary descriptions don't depict a morbidly obese man. They show someone who was somewhat heavy, yes, but not proportionally large enough to match the internal organ size discovered during the autopsy. This disconnect between external appearance and internal reality suggests something more complex than simple overeating leading to obesity. His body was somehow processing and distributing the massive caloric intake in ways that didn't result in extreme external obesity, but instead focused the impact internally on the digestive organs themselves. The metabolic implications are staggering. Louis XIV must have had an extraordinarily high metabolism, burning through calories at a rate that prevented massive weight gain, despite consuming food quantities that should have made him weigh 500 pounds or more. Or perhaps his stretched intestines weren't absorbing nutrients efficiently, allowing much of what he ate to pass through without being fully processed. The autopsy notes mention that his intestines showed signs of chronic inflammation and damage, which could impair nutrient absorption. Either way, what we're looking at is a biological paradox, a human body that had adapted to extreme conditions in ways that bent the rules of anatomy and physiology. And the more the physicians examined, the more abnormalities they discovered. The king's liver was enlarged, though not to the same dramatic degree as his digestive organs. It showed signs of fatty infiltration and cirrhosis, likely from the massive amounts of wine Louis consumed daily. Historical records indicate he drank wine with every meal, often several bottles throughout the day. His pancreas, that crucial organ responsible for producing digestive enzymes and regulating blood sugar, was inflamed and scarred. This suggested chronic pancreatitis, a painful condition that would have caused episodes of severe abdominal pain. Yet again, historical records show Louis rarely complained of such pain, or if he did, it was normalized to the point of not being remarked upon. His pain tolerance must have been extraordinary. Or perhaps he had simply lived with discomfort for so long that he considered it normal. The physicians noted his spleen was also enlarged, and there were adhesions throughout the abdominal cavity, bands of scar tissue that had formed between organs, evidence of previous infections or inflammatory episodes that had healed over time. As the autopsy continued, Marechal made careful note of every finding, knowing that this documentation would be crucial for medical science, even if it had to remain partially secret. The king's esophagus showed signs of chronic acid reflux, with scarring and inflammation that extended from the stomach all the way up to the throat. This makes sense when you consider the massive volumes of acidic stomach contents that must have regularly pushed upward, especially when the king lay down after his enormous meals. The diaphragm, that muscular sheet separating the chest from the abdomen, was pushed upward and stretched thin, distorted by the enlarged organs pressing from below. This would have affected Louis's breathing, possibly explaining some of the respiratory issues documented in his later years. The autopsy revealed that his ribcage had actually begun to deform. The lower ribs pushed outward and bent to accommodate the swollen abdominal organs beneath them. This was skeletal remodeling, caused by decades of internal pressure, a permanent transformation of his very bone structure. Every aspect of his torso had been warped, twisted, adapted to contain organs that had grown beyond human norms. The physicians were documenting not just medical anomalies, but a complete biological transformation. The measurements and observations continued for hours, extending into the early morning. By candlelight, the physicians worked methodically through every organ system, determined to compile a complete record. When they finally finished examining the digestive system and moved to other areas of the body, they discovered the anatomical horrors weren't limited to his stomach and intestines. Louis XIV's legs were gangrenous, blackened flesh that had been slowly dying for weeks before his death. The autopsy revealed that the gangrene had spread far deeper than anyone had realized, extending into the bone in some areas. His left leg was particularly ravaged, and the physicians concluded that had he lived another week, amputation would have been absolutely necessary. But given the king's age and overall condition, such surgery would likely have killed him anyway. His feet showed evidence of severe gout, with uric acid crystals deposited in the joints, causing the deformities and chronic pain that had plagued him in his final years. The cardiovascular system revealed a heart that was enlarged, working overtime to pump blood through a body that had become increasingly difficult to maintain. His arteries showed significant atherosclerosis, hardening and narrowing that restricted blood flow, and contributed to the gangrene in his extremities. Perhaps most disturbing to the physicians, who still had to consider the king's public image and legacy, was the state of his mouth. Louis XIV had only 4 teeth remaining at the time of his death. 4 out of 32. The rest had either fallen out or been extracted during his lifetime by royal dentists, whose treatments often did more harm than good. His gums were infected, riddled with abscesses that had likely caused chronic low-grade bacteremia, bacteria constantly seeping into his bloodstream from his mouth. This would explain the recurring fevers and infections documented throughout his life. The palace physicians had tried various treatments over the years, including the barbaric practice of cauterizing infected gum tissue with hot irons, which naturally only made things worse. The lack of teeth meant Louis had difficulty properly chewing his food, which ironically might have contributed to the digestive issues by forcing his stomach to work harder to break down large, poorly chewed pieces of meat and other foods. It was all connected, a cascade of medical problems that fed into each other, creating a body that was simultaneously adapted to extreme conditions and falling apart from the strain. The physicians also examined his skin, noting the numerous scars and lesions that covered his body. Some were from smallpox, which he had contracted as a young man, and survived, though it left permanent pockmarks across his face. Others were from various injuries, surgeries, and the ulcers that had developed in his later years. There were burn scars from medical treatments involving hot pokers and cauterization, standard medical practice of the era, but brutally traumatic nonetheless. His spine showed signs of degenerative arthritis, the vertebrae compressed and damaged from decades of bearing the weight of his enlarged abdomen and overall physical strain. This would have caused chronic back pain, though again, historical records suggest Louis rarely complained about it publicly. He maintained the appearance of vigor and strength almost until the very end, a testament to either his pain tolerance or his commitment to the royal image of perfection. But here, laid bare on the autopsy table, the truth was unavoidable. Louis XIV had been suffering in ways that the public never saw, dealing with a body that was fundamentally broken and deformed, held together through sheer willpower and the ministrations of physicians who did their best with the limited medical knowledge of the time. Now we arrive at the question that haunted the physicians as they worked through that long night, and continues to fascinate medical historians today. How did Louis XIV function with this anatomy? How did he not only survive but thrive, ruling France with an iron fist, engaging in multiple wars, fathering numerous children, and maintaining an active lifestyle well into his 70s? The human body's capacity for adaptation is remarkable, but this seemed to push beyond reasonable limits. Part of the answer lies in the gradual nature of the changes. The extreme organ enlargement didn't happen overnight. It developed slowly over decades, giving Louis's body time to adjust, to compensate, to find new equilibriums. His metabolism adapted, his cardiovascular system strengthened to handle the increased demands. His skeletal structure shifted to accommodate the changing internal geography. In some ways, he became a different kind of human, optimized for a lifestyle of extreme consumption that would have killed most people within years. The physicians theorized that his body had achieved a kind of pathological homeostasis, a stable state that was fundamentally unhealthy but functionally viable. It's similar to how chronic alcoholics can maintain relatively normal function despite liver damage that would incapacitate others, or how people living at high altitudes develop physiological adaptations to low oxygen that would be considered abnormal at sea level. But there was a cost. The autopsy revealed that virtually every organ system in Louis XIV's body showed signs of chronic stress and damage. His kidneys were scarred and beginning to fail. His lungs had reduced capacity due to the compressed diaphragm and distorted ribcage. His nervous system showed evidence of neuropathy, nerve damage that would have caused numbness and pain in his extremities. The massive digestive system that had allowed him to consume legendary quantities of food had essentially cannibalized the rest of his body, stealing resources and space, creating a biological priority that put digestion above all other functions. In his final years, this delicate balance began to collapse. The gangrene that killed him was really just the final manifestation of a body that had been pushed beyond sustainable limits. His cardiovascular system could no longer adequately supply blood to his extremities. His immune system, weakened by chronic inflammation and infection, couldn't fight off the bacterial invasion in his legs. The digestive system that had dominated his anatomy for so long was now actively contributing to his death, as malnutrition from impaired absorption and the metabolic demands of his enlarged organs drained his body's remaining reserves. The autopsy also revealed something that the physicians found deeply unsettling from a theological perspective. Louis XIV had claimed divine right, the idea that he ruled by God's will, that his kingship was ordained by heaven itself. This belief was fundamental to absolute monarchy and the legitimacy of his rule. But here, opened on the table, was a body that seemed anything but divinely perfect. It was deformed, damaged, fundamentally flawed in ways that suggested not divine blessing, but biological curse. How could a body so grotesquely abnormal house a soul chosen by God to rule? This theological crisis added urgency to the need for secrecy. If word got out about the true state of the king's anatomy, it could undermine the entire concept of divine right monarchy. Enemies of absolutism would seize on it as proof that kings were not chosen by God, but were simply men, flawed and mortal and sometimes biological freaks. The physicians understood that their documentation served two purposes. First, for medical science to record an unprecedented case of anatomical abnormality. Second, for political necessity, to provide enough information to satisfy court requirements, while obscuring the most disturbing details from public knowledge. As dawn broke over Versailles on September 2nd, Marechal and his team finally completed their work. The body of Louis XIV was carefully sewn back together, prepared for the elaborate funeral rites that would unfold over the coming weeks. But the physicians knew they had witnessed something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They had seen inside the Sun King and found not divine perfection, but human monstrosity. In the days that followed, they compiled their official report, carefully choosing language that conveyed medical findings without revealing the full extent of the anatomical horrors. They described organs as larger than normal rather than twice the normal size. They mentioned digestive irregularities instead of detailing the grotesque distension and scarring. The measurements were recorded accurately but buried in technical language that most courtiers wouldn't fully understand. A sanitized version was released for public consumption, focusing on the gangrene that caused his death and mentioning some enlarged organs, but framing it as a consequence of his age and lifestyle rather than a fundamental biological abnormality. The full, uncensored autopsy report was locked away, shown only to a select few members of the royal family and senior court officials. But secrets have a way of leaking out, especially when they're this disturbing. Over the following decades and centuries, fragments of the truth emerged. Physicians who had been present wrote private letters to colleagues, sharing details they couldn't include in official documents. These letters circulated through medical communities across Europe, discussed in hushed tones in universities and anatomical theaters. The legend of Louis XIV's abnormal anatomy grew, embellished by some accounts, downplayed by others, but never completely forgotten. In the 19th century, medical historians began piecing together the various accounts, trying to reconstruct what the autopsy had really revealed. They found the original measurements buried in archives, cross-referenced testimonies from multiple sources, and slowly built a more complete picture. What emerged confirmed the most extreme claims. Louis XIV had indeed possessed a digestive system of truly abnormal proportions, organs enlarged to a degree that pushed the boundaries of human anatomy. Modern medical analysis of the historical records suggests he likely suffered from a combination of genetic predisposition and extreme environmental factors. The genetic component gave him organs capable of unusual expansion and a metabolism that could process the massive food intake. The environmental component, his lifestyle of unlimited feasting, pushed those organs to their absolute limits. But even today, with all our advanced medical knowledge, cases like Louis XIV's remain rare and poorly understood. There are documented instances of people with enlarged organs due to various medical conditions, but few, if any, match the extreme proportions found in the Sun King. Competitive eaters provide some modern comparison, individuals who have trained their stomachs to expand dramatically. But even the most successful competitive eaters, people like Joey Chestnut or Takeru Kobayashi, don't approach the organ sizes documented in Lewis's autopsy. And they achieve their capacities through specific training techniques, eating enormous amounts rapidly, and then allowing their stomachs to contract again. Louis XIV ate massive quantities constantly, multiple times daily for his entire life. The sustained nature of his extreme eating created permanent anatomical changes that competitive eaters avoid by cycling between extreme eating and normal consumption. Medical researchers studying the historical case of Louis XIV have proposed that he may represent an extreme example of what's called adaptive hyperphagia, where the body not only tolerates but actively accommodates excessive food intake through physiological restructuring. It's a controversial theory because it suggests the human body can transform itself in ways that seem almost evolutionary, adapting to extreme conditions within a single lifetime. The story of Louis XIV's anatomy raises profound questions about human biology and its limits. How much can the human body change and adapt while still remaining functionally human? At what point does adaptation become deformity? Louis lived for 77 years with an anatomy that should have been impossible, that seemed to defy medical understanding. He functioned, he ruled, he lived what many would consider a successful life despite, or perhaps because of, his biological abnormalities. Does that make his condition an adaptation? A bizarre form of evolution in action? Or was it simply a pathology, a disease process that happened to be compatible with survival in his unique circumstances? The physicians of 1715 had no framework to answer these questions. They could only document what they saw, record measurements that seemed impossible, and struggled to reconcile the anatomical reality before them with their understanding of human physiology. Modern medicine hasn't fully resolved these questions either. We have better tools, more sophisticated understanding of genetics and metabolism, but cases of such extreme anatomical variation remain medical mysteries. Louis XIV stands as a unique case in medical history, a human body that pushed beyond normal limits and survived, thrived even, for reasons we still don't completely understand. The final chapter of this medical mystery unfolded during the French Revolution, nearly 80 years after Louis XIV's death. Revolutionary forces desecrated the royal tombs at Saint-Denis, scattering bones and destroying monuments in their rage against the monarchy. What remained of Louis XIV's body was disturbed, scattered, lost to history. Any possibility of modern forensic examination, of applying contemporary medical technology to verify the autopsy findings, was destroyed by revolutionary fury. We're left with only the historical documents, the measurements and observations recorded by physicians who witnessed what they could barely comprehend. Some skeptics argue that the autopsy reports must have been exaggerated, that no human could have the organ proportions described. But multiple independent sources corroborate the findings, and the physicians who performed the autopsy were respected medical professionals with no clear motive to fabricate such dramatic claims. If anything, they had incentive to downplay the abnormalities to protect the monarchy's reputation. The fact that even the sanitized official reports acknowledged significant anatomical irregularities suggests the reality was even more extreme than most contemporaries knew. We're forced to accept that Louis XIV really did possess this grotesque anatomy, that the Sun King truly was biologically abnormal in ways that challenge our understanding of human limits. So, what's the final verdict on Louis XIV's anatomy? Was he fully human? From a strictly biological perspective, yes. His DNA would have been human. his cellular structure human, his basic physiology human. But his anatomy had been pushed so far beyond normal parameters that it inhabited a gray zone between typical human variation and genuine abnormality. He was a human who had become something slightly different through a combination of genetic factors and extreme lifestyle. A body that had adapted to conditions no other human quite matched. The autopsy of 1715 revealed not a monster, but a man whose biology had been warped by circumstances into a form that seemed monstrous. His oversized stomach and intestines, his deformed skeleton, his failing organs, all told the story of a body pushed to its absolute limits, and somehow managing to function for over 7 decades. The French court's efforts to suppress this information were ultimately futile. The truth, as disturbing as it was, couldn't be completely erased. Louis XIV's anatomical abnormalities became a dark footnote to his glorious reign. A reminder that beneath the grandeur and divine right claims was a human body, subject to the same biological laws as anyone else, just pushed far beyond their normal expression. The Sun King died with a secret inside him that shocked even experienced surgeons, a truth about human anatomy that still fascinates and disturbs medical professionals today. If you found this deep dive into one of history's most disturbing royal autopsies fascinating, hit that subscribe button, because we're uncovering more hidden medical truths about historical figures that textbooks leave out. Drop a comment telling me which ruler or historical figure you want me to investigate next, because, trust me, Louis XIV wasn't the only one hiding biological secrets. And smash that like button if this made you look at history differently, because supporting this channel means we can keep bringing you the dark, verified medical truths that challenge everything you thought you knew about the past.